Welcome everybody to this evening's public forum, a conversation with John Howard. I'm Professor Michael Frater. I'm the Rector of UNSW Canberra at the Australian Defence Force Academy. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay respect to their elders past and present. UNSW has been proudly educating the future leaders of the Australian Defence Force here in Canberra for half a century. There's a number of things about UNSW Canberra which are quite unique in the Australian tertiary sector. One of them is that about 46% of our undergraduate students come from families with no prior university education. And this is something that's very rare to find in a top university in Australia, and in fact these days in the world. But we also have a very large number of postgraduate students, and in fact every year we graduate nearly twice as many students in postgraduate programs as we do in undergraduate programs. In fact, UNSW Canberra is really, in a sense, the nation's most national university. And we're certainly unique in Australia in having the integrated defence focus. And our goal here is to provide the best possible university for defence. And this requires both excellence and relevance, and is exemplified by our activities in cybersecurity, our space program, and conflict studies. Last year, UNSW Canberra received the papers of Australia's 25th and second longest serving Prime Minister, John Howard. And through our library, they're now available to the public. And this became possible through a unique partnership with the National Archives of Australia. And we want to thank the archives for their collaboration and support. And on a personal note, I would particularly like to thank David Fricker, the Director General of the National Archives, for his vision in developing this partnership. Having received these papers, we have opened the John Howard Reading Room in our library, where visitors can research UNSW Canberra special collections, and those include the papers of John Howard. John Howard's papers are a very important extra dimension for the special collections in our library, and they're a great asset for the research at UNSW Canberra and also, more broadly, for research into Australian politics and history. We're very privileged to have Mr. Howard here tonight to share his thoughts on leadership. As I said, he's Australia's second longest serving Prime Minister. He also has a very important connection to defence, because it was during his term as Prime Minister that the big increase in overseas operations occurred. It's also my pleasure to welcome back to UNSW Canberra Professor Fred Hilmer, the former President and Vice Chancellor of UNSW Australia, who served the university from 2006 until January this year, and in fact used to be my boss. Prior to this, he made a number of major contributions, including leading the Independent Commission of Inquiry into Competition Policy, which underpins much of the current thinking in Australia on that subject. And he's also written extensively on business strategy, organisation and economic reform. Please join me in welcoming John Howard and Fred Hilmer.
Well, thank you, Michael. And people ask me what I miss about not being Vice-Chancellor. I do miss not being your boss. But good evening and welcome to what I think you'll find is a fascinating discussion on a very important topic. If you think about where we are as a country and, in a sense, where the world is, there's no shortage of massive challenges. I mean, economic challenges, business challenges, challenges to our social institutions, whether it's the church or the military or education. And so, when we reflect on those challenges and think about how we're going to get through them in a decent way, we always come back to one answer. We need more, better leadership. Leadership is the answer to these major problems. And it's clearly a difficult thing to do, to find, to apply, because what we've observed is that leaders change more frequently. I mean, we talk of your record, Mr. Howard, as 11 years since you left office, I think we've had 3 Prime Ministers. And we see the same thing in the corporate world. The average tenure of a corporate chief executive now is 4 years. So I think today it's a great treat for us to be able to talk about this leadership issue with a man who's been a leader at the highest level and worked with leaders at the highest level. And I'm delighted that you've agreed to be full and frank. Let me just start with a question that I think is very relevant to particularly the officer cadets here. But how did you learn about leadership? As you became a leader, what were some of the lessons and where did you get them from? How do you become a leader?
I think, like anybody who's had a leadership position, you learn most from, to use the colloquialism, the life of hard knocks. I was leader of the Liberal Party fairly unsuccessfully for a number of years. And my colleagues concluded that, and so they got rid of me. And then after trying a couple of other leaders and losing 2 more elections, they decided to invite me back. Not because they thought, I was entitled to it or it was my turn again, or they'd unfairly treated me before. They just concluded that I probably had a better chance of leading them to victory than anybody else. Now, what did I learn? What I did during that period in the wilderness, so to speak, I reflected on the errors I'd made and tried to ensure the next time I had an opportunity, if I was lucky enough to have one, that I would be more successful. Now that is a big way you learn leadership, but there are many important things about leadership, but there are 2 or 3 that really stand out. The most important thing for a leader in political life is to believe in something. I mean, the thing that you remember about people is whether they believe in something. And I had plenty of uncomplimentary things said about me in my political life. I never minded people saying, though, I can't stand John Howard, but at least I know what he believes in. And that's important. And I found myself often saying of people on the other side of politics, I don't agree with him, but at least he's trying to achieve something and he's trying to achieve his agenda. So I think having a strong set of beliefs is tremendously important. The other thing, and it's not the only other prescription, is you've got to make sure you get the big things right. All leaders at various stages make mistakes. It's probably no secret to many in this audience that, like millions of other people, I regarded Winston Churchill as the towering political figure of the 20th century. But gee, he got a lot of things wrong along the way. It's a very long list, but the key thing is that he got the big things right. He identified almost alone the menace of Nazi Germany in the 1930s. He gave tremendous leadership to his country and to the world at a very dark time. So there's some of the things, but I have to say the thing that taught me more about leadership than anything else was the experience of being there. And nothing prepares you to lead a political party. It's much harder than anybody thinks because political parties are full of legitimately ambitious people. Who,
sounds like a university.
Yes. And like a university, they all think they can do the job as well, if not better than you. And it's in the nature of things that those theories should be tested.
Did you have any particular role models or mentors that,
I don't know that I had a role model. I think along the way I picked up things. I had one person who I'd identify as a mentor, a man who's now 96 years of age, John Carrick, who was the Minister for Education in the Fraser government. He was a POW of the Japanese in World War II. He was captured in East Timor, and he was in a prisoner of war camp with quite a number of other men who became members of Parliament. John was the General Secretary of the Liberal Party in New South Wales when I joined it, and he taught me more about politics than anybody else. And The key thing he taught me was that politics was a contest of ideas, a battle of ideas and values, not a public relations contest. I think sometimes that is forgotten, and that's true of both sides. I looked at former Prime Ministers. I admired the way Menzies spoke. He's the greatest political orator that I've ever seen or heard. I picked up some hints about how to run cabinets and not to run cabinets from some of my predecessors on both sides. You can have too many cabinet meetings, and Prime Ministers should always turn up on time. And Prime Ministers should also learn to delegate. Bob Hawke rightly said, in an interview I once saw him give, he said, prioritising is very important. I often say that 90% of the pieces of advice that came across my table as Prime Minister from departments were impeccable and should be given a tick and a flick straight away. But the problem is you've got to work out what the 10% is. Yeah. And that's where you need judgment and where you need good staff.
When you mentioned that you formed a lot of your ideas when you're in the wilderness after you got things wrong.
Ideas on how to be a better leader.
And what were some of the things that you'd say, I shouldn't have done that, I made some mistakes, and I'm going to do it differently when I get another shot?
Well, one of them was to recognise, as I frequently said when I was Prime Minister, that the Liberal Party is a broad, I'm talking obviously from a Liberal perspective.
Yes.
I didn't get a chance of leading any other party, but the Liberal Party is a broad church here. The Liberal Party of Australia is a centre-right party, and it's the custodian of two political traditions, the small L Liberal, classical Liberal tradition, and the Conservative tradition. The Liberal Party is a party of reform, but it's also a party of tradition. And you need to have a proper balance of those two things, and you need, in the personnel choices you make, to reflect that balance. And if you do that, you don't get into so much trouble. I don't think I did that well enough the first time around. I was perhaps a little too ideological in the sense of thinking that you had to have people thinking all the same thing. Now, providing you do it within the confines of a cabinet system, you should always allow people to express their strongest possible views. And once having done so in the forums of the government, then you can impose the discipline of cabinet. It's very important in our system of government that Prime Ministers don't ambush cabinets with announcements outside of cabinet unless they're absolutely essential. I try to avoid that. I mean, sometimes it's unavoidable, but in most cases, ministers don't like reading in the morning paper about what they're going to decide. They are quite precious, and understandably so. I didn't like it when it happened to me as a minister. It did occasionally, and I think that's a very important lesson.
I guess in learning that lesson, did you feel, well, let me come back, and in observing you and over the years, and we've run into each other a number of times, I've seen you very much as a people person, and that you develop networks very effectively, and you remember people and you know people. How important was that in dealing with this issue of constructing the broad church? Oh,
very important. If you're in a leadership position, whether it's in the military, whether it's a company, a sporting team, political party, remembering simple things like remembering people's names, remembering their names of their wives or husbands, remembering personal anecdotes, details, asking about it. It does matter. I mean, it matters to me if somebody I run into I haven't seen for years and they remember something about my daughter or wife or one of my sons, and they ask how's so-and-so going with this, that and the other. You think, oh, that's good. And it's very simple, but it's very, very important. And I don't know that I was so flash at that earlier on, but I got better at it, and it does help enormously.
In your book, the Lazarus book, you talked about the difference between business leadership and political leadership, and that making the transition from one to the other, and I think you talked about John Elliott, was quite difficult and generally didn't work. You want to just tease that out a bit?
Yeah,
first?
look, I think there's a mistake in assuming that Australia is the biggest company and running Australia is just like running a big company, only it's bigger. I mean, that, frankly, is nonsense. It's uninformed nonsense, because running a country, running a government, running a political party is vastly different from running a company. And you can't just snap your fingers and give instructions. And you do have to involve people. You do have to take them with you in ways that are simply not required of a corporate leader. Now, I think businessmen and women need to know more about the political process and about how it works than they do, and I equally think people in politics need to know more about how businesses work than they do. Some people make the transition. I mean, we have, over the years I was in politics, quite a lot of people made very successful transitions from often smaller sized businesses rather than large corporations. There weren't too many examples of that. A lot of examples of people in Parliament, particularly on our side, that have been in business, run farms, run small businesses, and have made a transition. And in the last Parliament, we got somebody who'd been heavily involved years earlier with McKinsey's, Angus Taylor, who's the member for Hume. He had a very interesting business background. Now, getting people like that coming in is very important. I think you need an occupational blend. And all political parties have got to worry about that. They've got to worry about the modern phenomenon of there probably being too many people in politics, particularly state parliaments, whose only life's experience has been working in politics. They go to the university. If they're of Labor disposition, they work then in a union office, often not fixing any verandas or fixing any ceiling switches, but in the union office, and then into Parliament. And in the case of our side, they go to university, they give the union a miss, or it gives them a miss, and then they go, and then they don't work in a politician's office. Now, all of that is good up to a point, but you've got to have some life's experience, whether it's in a small business, a profession, a school teacher, a public servant, doesn't matter what it is, because it gives you an understanding of what other people do.
What about military leadership? I mean, there's another sphere, and there's probably a different kind of leadership again. And how would you contrast that with business leadership?
Well, I think there are some things that are common to politics, business and the military. And that is that the most important relationship, in a way, you have is with the people you immediately lead. Yeah. And the most important relationship that I had when I was Prime Minister was the one I immediately had with my cabinet colleagues and my parliamentary party colleagues, because if you have them singing from the same hymn sheet and on side, then you'll avoid difficulty. And the same thing applies with a military leader, with his or her chief staff officers and people immediately around them. Doesn't mean to say you're not cognizant of the feelings of people outside that immediate group, but if you've got them working with you and for you, you are far more successful. Now, I think that applies to a CEO or chairman and his board. If you've got and your immediate executive officers, if you've got them working with you. I mean, you know, and from your very, very extensive business experience, the companies that have that harmony and sympathy between the CEO and the board and the senior people in the company, and if that person has the confidence of those people, then that solves a lot of problems.
You mentioned Winston Churchill as a towering figure in the last century. Who would be, if you had to name three great leaders, who would you name and why?
Oh, well, I would name Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and I think you also have to, I'm talking of relatively contemporary time, I think you have to include Nelson Mandela in that because, I mean, the extraordinary thing about him was his generosity of spirit. I mean, to have such an extraordinary attitude towards people who had incarcerated him for 28 years. Showed a remarkable, it demonstrated a remarkable example. I thought that Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were great figures. I thought for the role that he played in bringing about what I might loosely call the spiritual destruction of Soviet communism, I thought Pope John Paul II was a remarkable leader as well.
Thatcher and Reagan, quite different.
Very different.
So what was sort of the
Well, I think
common thread of what they did well?
Obviously there'd be people in this audience who wouldn't share the philosophical views of Thatcher and Reagan, or indeed mine. I understand that. I think what both of them had in common was that well, certainly Thatcher's case, she turned the country around. I mean, Britain's a country I know quite well. I have some real affection for it. I thought it was in a dire predicament in the late 1970s, and it was very difficult, and she turned it around. I think what Ronald Reagan did was gave to America an extraordinary sense of hope and optimism. They were different. She was far more a detail person than he was.
Yeah,
he was just sort of this, and this, and everything. You can fix the rest of it up, George, or whatever. But she was into all the detail. But they both believed in a greater role for the market, and they were both had an uncomplicated commitment to individual freedom. And when Reagan said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, he was serious. Yeah. And in the end, of course, the wall was torn down. And I think those two people and the Pope at a moral, spiritual level played a major role in bringing about the end of Soviet communism, which has been the most defining political event in my lifetime.
So all of those had big ideas, and I think you said earlier that was the first.
You knew what they stood for. Yeah. You may have hated it, and there are a lot of people who hated Thatcher, a lot of people who hated Reagan, and a lot of people probably be surprised at my giving the role I have to the Pope. But they, I mean, particularly the two politicians, they had very strong values and very strong ideas, and that's true of people in any kind of politics.
How do you think Thatcher was able to get away with micromanaging? I mean, you talked about, the party being a broad church and, not second-guessing ministers and them learning what they had to do in the paper. But you wouldn't have said that of Thatcher.
No.
And yet, I think most people say she was effective as a leader in the sense that she knew where she wanted to take the country and she took it there.
I think that made her a bit different is that she really took on 2 or 3 major issues where decisive action was required. I mean, obviously the tremendous fight she had with the unions over coal and steel, and of course with the print unions at Wapping, which changed the face of journalism not only in Britain but around the world. I think she was able to do that, but she was difficult, but she could also, so I'm told by many people who worked with her, she could be intensely charming. And the depiction of her in that movie by Meryl Streep, in my view, was quite wrong. It depicted her as a bully of men. I'm told that was not the case. She exerted very considerable personal charm.
Let me flip the question
And of
around.
course, the extraordinary thing is that she was the first ever female Prime Minister of Britain, and it was, in a sense, still a trailblazer in that area, although you'd had Golda Meir and Mrs. Bandaranaike and Mrs. Gandhi. But when people talk about, a certain segment of the political community talks about the achievements of women in public life, they never talk about Margaret Thatcher. One almost has the impression that in their eyes she was the wrong type of woman because of her views. Just think about that.
Yeah.
That's just a little aside of mine, don't take me notice of.
If we look at it from the other side, and I think in your book you talked about people who failed as leaders. I mean, I think if you're going to learn, you can learn from success. You also learn from observing failures and understanding why. So, you know, what are some of the failures that you've observed in leadership, and what are the lessons you draw from that, or what advice would you give people here today to learn from some of those failures?
Well, I think people who've failed in leadership in politics have largely failed because they haven't kept faith with some of the fundamental things that they've stated. I know one shouldn't speak ill of the dead, but we were talking earlier about Britain. Margaret Thatcher's predecessor, Ted Heath, was elected as a believer in open markets and and being on the centre right of politics, but he implemented a very restrictive interventionist economic policies, prices and income freezes and so forth like that. I think people have a certain impression of you as a leader. When you get there and they give you a go, I mean, the Australian public is very generous with new leaders. They normally give them a go, cut them a lot of slack. But if you say something is a huge thing and then you don't, then you walk away from it, I think that is a huge mistake.
In political life, one of the things you've had to deal with, I think every PM has to deal with, but is the media and the many people who know how to do the job better than you and want to be helpful and give you advice on what you should be doing. How did you deal with that? And in particular, how did you deal with what were sometimes quite vicious and nasty attacks?
Well, you have to put up with, you have to have a thick skin. Anybody who thinks that you're going to have a leadership position in politics and not be attacked and abused and so forth should not get onto the field. You have to accept that. And I don't know, I mean, the media said a lot of nasty things about me, but they said a lot of nasty things. They say a lot of nasty things about Tony Abbott. They said a lot of nasty things about Paul Keating, Julia Gillard, Kevin Rudd. I mean, it's the nature of things. I don't regard the media as the sort of explanation for such difficulties as people think the political process has. I think it's a cop-out for politicians to blame the media. I mean, you can criticise the media on individual issues, but in the end they're only doing their job. I'm a believer that there are three things that keep this country free. You've got a vigorous, robust political system. You may get angry with it, but it's a lot better than the alternative. You've got an incorruptible judiciary, and you've got a free and sceptical media. Now, you need to hang on to those three things. If you got them, you don't need a Bill of Rights. I don't believe in bills of rights. I don't believe in writing things down. That can lead to endless debate. I think you just have those three things, and I think they hold the place together. The media, how did I handle it? Well, I talked to them. I was available. I talked a lot. I went on the media a lot. Even people who the public knew that we jousted. I mean, I used to usually accept Kerry O'Brien's invitations to go on the 740 report. And here, I've got a rough suspicion he didn't sort of support me. I don't know where I got that impression from, but I did. But that's his right. He's a free citizen, and if he were here, he'd give me all the reasons why he didn't, if that's the case. But I think you've got to. I'm not really keen on this idea of picking and choosing between different media. Playing favourites with the media can get you into trouble. I think that's... But I use talkback radio a lot. I found it the most intimate media of all, and you can communicate with people on talkback radio. You actually have people listening to you, and it's unfiltered. Even if it's only for 2 or 3 minutes, they actually hear your explanation. If Neil Mitchell said to me, "Why are you doing this, Mr. Howard?" and I'd say, "For the following reason." And then somebody listens to that for a minute even, and they at least hear me say it. I have a news conference say why I did it. I mean, I'm at the mercy of news editors and journalists as to whether it's reported.
You mentioned to deal with media, and I think it's true in leadership roles. Generally, you need to have a thick skin.
Yeah.
Because if all you're doing is doing what people want, then you're not leading. How do you develop a thick skin, or what is it about your circumstance or your family life, your upbringing? Why is it that some people are able to have what you call a thick skin, or the ability to really deflect unwanted or unwarranted criticism, and other people are really torn up by it?
Well, it depends on your personality, and there are some personalities completely unsuited to politics, and they recognise that, even though they're interested in certain issues, they just realise it's not for them. I think you develop it, obviously, if you have a fairly strong self-belief and if you have a supportive home life, which I was fortunate enough to have, then that also helps. But also if you have a driving ambition, and we often use the word ambition in a pejorative way. There's nothing wrong with ambition.
Yeah.
It's a very legitimate aspiration to want to do a lot better and in certain circumstances replace somebody because you think you can do a better job. I mean, I don't condemn, if somebody says to me, oh, so-and-so's too ambitious, and I sort of think, well, really? You don't seriously mean that. It means you don't really want that person to get where that person wants to go. That's what you really mean. So all of those things. But the truth is, Professor, that there are some people who, from a personality point of view, are not cut out for politics.
Do you think you can teach some of these attributes that we've been talking about, or you think leaders, in a sense, are born and not made?
Well, I think it's a combination always of the two. If somebody who doesn't get better with the experience is an odd specimen, but there's a thing called instinct and judgment. And I always found that if you had a difficult issue, in the end you had to fall back onto your instinct. And many decisions I took were very on balance, but you had an instinctive feeling which was the right direction in which to go. And I'd like to think I got the majority of them correct. I'm not sure everybody would agree with it, but I think you have to accept that. But you certainly are an odd person if you don't learn from experience and you don't allow experience and the world of hard knocks to teach you something along the way.
Having ambitious people, as you say, can be a strength of a team. How did you pick your team? And if someone wasn't performing on the team, again, one of the harder sides of leadership, how did you deal with that?
Well, I tried to pick the team on the strength, on the basis of the people who were likely to do the best job in the job that was suitable to them. I mean, that's stating sort of the bleeding obvious, so to speak. But I think very much when you're a Prime Minister or a leader of a team like that, you've got to accept that along with the authority to make the decisions, which a leader on our side has always had, carries the responsibility that if you're unhappy with somebody, you've got to do the changes. You've got to front people, and there's nothing worse than reading in the paper that you might get the sack. Yeah. If you're a minister, that's quite unnerving. And I think Prime Ministers who avoid that responsibility and avoid talking very directly and in a very frontal way with somebody build up extraordinary challenges for the future. It's not easy, but then it shouldn't be easy. It's a huge responsibility, and if you've got the right to decide that somebody should have a big job. I mean, Malcolm Fraser, with whom I had some differences as the years went by, he was very generous to me at the beginning. He first made me a junior minister when he was elected in 1975. He chose me above others. He made that judgment, and that was of great help to my career, and I'm grateful for that. But it was an important moment because it gave me the chance to do things. And people who he passed over didn't have that chance. So I tried to remember that later on when I was in the same position. If I had to let somebody go, I would tell them myself, and I would tell them why. Now, sort of didn't make them any happier, but at least they couldn't complain that I didn't front them myself.
There's quite a delicate line between leadership and friendship.
Mm.
You build a team, you go through a lot together, but at the end of the day, you're the person, as the leader, who has to say whether you stay on the team or whether you've outlived your time on the team. But at the same time, having done things together, you've become friends. How do you draw that line between leadership and friendship?
Well, the way you draw the line, in my experience in politics, is to observe the rules of candour, the requirement of candour in dealing and with the relationship. And I guess there is always, particularly for people who are not really close to you on a personal basis, there's always a little bit of a reserve, not in an unfriendly way, but just against the possibility that sometime in the future you have to make a decision about that person's future that they may not like. And it's in the nature of men and women to, if they are dependent upon the continuing favour of a leader, to try and, in order to entrench their position, even if it happens unconsciously, they try and get as friendly as possible. Now, you have to be wary of that if it's not something that appears quite spontaneous. And you've no doubt been through those sort of situations where it suddenly occurred to you that a relationship is being cultivated rather than becoming the product of spontaneity. And you have to, I think, bear that in mind.
Yeah. No, I have experienced that. And
I'm sure you have.
And drawing that line between we're friends, but you're not doing the job that we need.
That can happen. And it is very difficult, and when it does happen, you can have some permanent alienation, and sometimes it's very public. Very, very public.
Yeah. You made a number of, I guess, really important calls, and if you look at the issues we're confronting today, probably one of the bravest was the GST. No one will even talk about reforming the GST, let alone introducing it if we had to do that today. And it almost cost you an election. How did you provide the leadership that enabled that to occur?
Well, I came to the conclusion that having been elected in 1996 with a big majority, very big majority, 44 or something or other, and having done a whole lot of things in the first couple of years, I came to the conclusion that that big majority was going to disappear anyway, so you might as well expend it on a good cause. And that is, but can I tell you...
But it's a very potent point.
It happens.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember 18 months after I was elected, I had had about 15 backbenchers over to the lodge for dinner, and they'd all been elected in 96, and many of them were what I call, miracle wins, particularly from Queensland. I mean, there were two of the people there were, one of them had beaten Wayne Swan, Lilly, and the other had beaten Kevin Rudd in his first attempt to be the Labor member for Griffith. And they were nice people, but I don't think they had expected to be there. And we were talking about the next election, and they said, "Oh, look, it's all going well. Just let's not do too much to, But I said, what you've got to realise is that the next election will be quite unlike the last one. I mean, the next election, I said the last election because we won big. I mean, obviously there was an anti-Labor, anti-Keating feeling in the community. That's why we won with such a big majority. So that won't be there. He's gone. And Kim Beazley was then the leader. People liked Beazley. He and I enjoyed quite a good relationship as opposite. So I said, we've got to have a new cause. We've got to have another reason. Now, I think the GST was a big ask, but I actually think that if I'd gone to that election without the GST, I may have done worse. Now, that's an interesting call, but I think it's true. The other thing that hurt us in that election was the Pauline Hanson phenomenon. That was one of the most difficult issues I had to deal with, because on the surface she'd said a couple of quite outrageous things, such as Aborigines are not a disadvantaged section of our community. That was the shorthand for what she was saying, and that the country was being flooded with Asians. Now, they were fairly inflammatory things to say, yet deep down she appealed to a lot of people because they didn't like the way the country that they thought they'd grown up in and so forth was changing, and they felt that they were being left behind. And I had to, on the one hand, point out where she was wrong, but on the other hand, not accuse everybody who was attracted to her of being a racist, because they weren't. So it was one of those issues where you had to have a very nuanced response. Sometimes in politics it's not a black and white. Sometimes you've got to have a very nuanced response. But I think the GST was, in the end people thought, well, we probably need this. We'd been talking about it for 25 years in Australia, and Paul Keating had proposed it, and I supported him from opposition, and then Hawke and Kelly said, no, it's not going to happen, and then John Hewson had proposed it and Keating attacked that, etc. And I said, no, we're not going to do it, and never ever, I think I said.
Yeah.
I think I said never ever, yes, I did. Anyway, a lot of people on the other side said I said never ever, so I must have said never ever. But we decided to put it to the people at the election, and we got back. Of all the big economic reforms of the 30 years leading up to then, probably floating the dollar was the one that had the biggest overall impact. It was the biggest change, and that was done by Bob Hawke with our support. But I think the one that was the most complicated and affected people's lives most was the GST. Yeah. I mean, floating the dollar didn't affect daily lives. We're going to have a varying exchange rate. It was a question whether the market did it or it was fixed by government fiat. And whereas the GST sort of infiltrated into everybody's lives, and it was, of course, very strongly opposed by our political opponents, very strongly.
I know we have to leave some time for some audience questions, but let me just ask you a concluding question about the state of leadership today, but not so much an assessment, but the state of the environment in which people have to lead, because the tenure of leaders is getting shorter and shorter, and the governance processes by which leaders are chosen, whether it's political, whether it's in the public service, seems to be working against any sort of long-term type thinking. And I'd be very interested in your assessment of the system within which people have to lead today, and your view as to if there is an issue, how it might be addressed.
Well, if I can just say something about the political ambience of it. One of the big differences now from what, say, 40, 50 years ago is that politics is far less tribal and far less ideological. It's more fragmented. There are a lot more single, self-contained issues. There are the rise of identity politics, where people say, well, it's an environmental view, or there's a gay view, or there's something new. The rise of that has had a big effect on politics. The divisions between the two sides of politics are not as clear as they were. They were once defined by the sort of left-wing Labor Party, the right-wing coalition. When I was first involved in politics, there was a 40-40-20 rule. Yeah. 40% always voted Labor, 40% always voted Liberal, and there were 20% in the middle. I now feel as though it's a 30-30-40 rule. Yeah. And people don't join political parties as much as they did. Each of the major political parties is less representative of the general body of people who vote for it, and therefore you've got greater influence of factions and potentially zealous people. and I like people with strong convictions, but I'm always a little wary of zealotry. I think most Australians are wary of zealotry. So I think that is a big factor, and it complicates leadership. It's never as easy. I mean, the Labor Party obviously has there are divisions in its ranks between what people loosely call the inner urban academic elite, who live in suburbs like Annandale in Sydney, and I often talk about the divide between Young Street Annandale and High Street Penrith. You get this division between, and the same thing. You get different views in the coalition between the so-called moderates, small L liberals, and the more conservative right-wing people. So I think that makes it a lot more difficult. And it also makes it even a greater imperative that leaders are seen to stand for something. People will move around and shift their allegiance a lot more readily now. I think the two political parties almost have a detachable flank of about 15%. In the case of the Labor Party, it wanders off to the Greens. At the last election, some of our vote wandered off to Clive Palmer. I hope it will wander back at the next election. But that's what you have got that. So I think those things make it a lot more, but it makes it all the more important that people are able to say, look, I'm going to vote for him and a vote for her because they believe in something. And that makes this first requirement of leadership, of which I spoke earlier, all the more essential.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank
I
you.
think that was a tremendously insightful conversation, and I think Michael has some questions from the audience that they provided ahead of time. So let me hand over to him.
Thank you.
Thank you. So as Professor Hilmer said, you were asked to provide questions in advance, and I have some of those here, and I'll ask those and give Mr. Howard a chance to answer. The first one is from Karen Middleton at SBS, and in fact is a neat segue from the last question, and is Australians routinely complain about government policy decisions that they don't like, but it has become increasingly common to hear a slightly different complaint of a lack of leadership, which seems to transcend ideology. So the question is, what's missing from the practice of Australian politics now that this should be such a prominent bipartisan phenomenon?
Well, I think, what was that last bit?
What's missing from the practice of Australian politics now that this should be such a prominent bipartisan phenomenon?
I think what I was talking about earlier, that the dividing lines are less clear. And it used to be the case that on any given issue you could say, well, the Labor Party's for greater government spending and greater government intervention, and the Liberal Party's for less. Now that's sort of not so often the case now. I mean, it's still largely, but not as often. And you've got these issues that are identity politics issues that are complicating it. I think that, but I also think there's a bit of a modern tendency that if you don't like a decision, you say, oh, he's not showing leadership. What you're really saying is, I don't agree with his decision. I mean, I used to get people saying, a lot of people used to say, oh, John, he's not displaying leadership on asylum seekers. And what they were really saying is they didn't agree with me. I don't think anybody was any doubt as to what my position was. Or he's not showing any leadership on industrial relations. I thought I was displaying plenty of leadership, but they just didn't like it. And I think we have to be careful that people don't capture the language. First thing I was taught when I had my very first debate in the second year at Canterbury High School years and years ago was that if you want to win the debate, first define the subject. If you define the subject and your opponent doesn't challenge it, you're halfway there to winning the debate, and this is what's happening at the present time.
Right. You were asked earlier about the GST, and we want to go back now to a much earlier big decision in the aftermath of the Port Arthur massacre, that your administration formulated the National Firearms Program Implementation Act, which met with considerable criticism from a large part of the Australian community, and in particular, your own constituents. How did you cope with this criticism, and how did your style of leadership change, if at all, with so many people questioning your authority?
It's true that our decision on guns divided the community, but it's also true that it was overwhelmingly popular in the cities, and it was also overwhelmingly popular amongst women. I remember a woman walked up to me in Pitt Street at the height of all of that, and she said, "I've never voted for you and I never will, but please don't back down on guns. You're absolutely right." Now, I mean, I know it's a focus group of one, and I don't read too much into it, but what it did create was a huge problem within our own ranks for particularly many of our country party members and rural Liberals, National Party members, and it was very hard on them, and I've retained to this day an enormous admiration for Tim Fisher and John Anderson and the former Queensland Premier Rob Borbidge, who really bore the brunt, because you had a lot of people in the bush who said, "Look, I've had a gun all my life, I've looked after it, I've never done anything wrong, and this, a character is coming along and saying, I can't have it." And it was one of the things that gave birth to One Nation. You had a lot of those flannel shirts who were really they didn't like their guns being taken from them. They didn't. And they were really very angry. And my problem was that most of them had voted for the coalition in 1996. I mean, all of our research told us that. But it was overwhelmingly the right thing to do. I mean, it's something in which I remain intensely proud. And it was a case of, I'd just been elected, and you had this huge majority, and we had this terrible tragedy. I mean, remember, until the Breivik slaughter in Norway a couple of years ago, this was the largest single mass shooting incident in the history of the world. And just one person to take out 35 people in remote Tasmania. Now, I took the view that I had to do something about it. And in the end, it was tough, and it probably did give birth to a bit of One Nation, but I think the great majority of the public was with us.
Right, so perhaps a question. You mentioned that was very early in your time as Prime Minister. So we have a question here. What advice would you give someone going into a leadership position for the first time?
Well, the advice above everything else that I would give them is to be yourself and to trust your own instincts, but listen to people around you before you make a final decision. Now, every new Prime Minister, in one way or another, will confront an extremely difficult issue. I mean, the gun thing was completely unexpected. But I think you can never underestimate instinct, and also never, and I'm talking politically again, you should never assume that a majority you've won at an election, even if it's only a few months earlier, is going to last. I mean, look at the extraordinary phenomenon of Queensland. I mean, the victory that was won by the LNP 3 years ago was the greatest victory. It was extraordinary. And we lost the election. Well, the LNP lost the election. Well, I say we, it's my side of politics. It's just a reminder of how... and there's a volatility about politics now. We've had now the third example of a one-time state government in the last 40 years, the one in Victoria. And we've had a couple of them before, in Western Australia and South Australia, but they're not common. So there's a great volatility. And if you think that by doing nothing you can sit on a big fat majority, you don't understand the mood of the electorate.
Right, so thank you. I think we're out of time for the questions now. So could everybody join with me in thanking Mr. Howard and Professor Hilmer?
Can I just say one very quick thing? I wouldn't want the opportunity to go by seeing I'm at ADFA and the presence of so many men and women in uniform that many lasting impressions I took away from my experience as Prime Minister. None was stronger than the great admiration and respect I had for the men and women of the ADF. I think the ADF is an ornament of this country, and it's not surprising that on the basis of regular assessments and opinion polls, it's, if not the most admired institution in Australia, it's close to being in that situation. And just wanted to take the opportunity of saying that it's something I feel very strongly. Thank you.
So I'd now like to ask David Fricker, who's the Director General of the National Archives of Australia, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Frater. And it is my pleasurable duty to offer the vote of thanks to Mr. Howard for his presence here this evening. And can I say, Mr. Howard, we have an awful lot to be thankful for. You know, we're reminded tonight that you are a central figure in the history of Australia, and indeed a world leader. And much of the discussion tonight is centred on domestic affairs and policy. None of us here can forget that you have been a major influence in international affairs and a major shaper of what we now regard as the international political landscape. Indeed. And look, tonight, you know, one of the questions that came up there was, is leadership something you can teach? And I don't know what the answer to that is, but it certainly is something you can learn, because all of us tonight here have learnt a great deal about leadership, and so much of it, I think, stems from the theme you continued to return to, which is about belief, which is about believing in something and remaining true to your beliefs. But also the other thing which came through, I think, was respect for those around you, that you also addressed some issues of how do you deliver bad news, perhaps, to some of your direct reports, and you gave us a clear message. You don't shy away from that. You don't leave it up to the media to deliver that message for you. You take a personal responsibility for that. And I think that that theme of conviction, of belief, of being authentic and being convinced in yourself gives you the courage to prosecute some of the many changes that you wish to pursue. And that GST episode, I think, was an excellent example of how you did that and how you took the hearts and minds of many with you, and again, fundamentally redesigned, in this case, the taxation, the landscape of Australia. So the opportunity for us to share this time with you this evening, and the generosity and the candour which you have shown all of us to share your own insights, has made this event something quite special this evening. It's been a fascinating, it's been an absorbing discussion, and it's given us all here a great deal to digest and a great deal to think upon. And I am also sure it's motivated a great deal of further research and study using the invaluable archival resources of the John Howard Collection now in its home here. May I also thank Emeritus Professor Fred Hilmer for your participation in this evening's event and the expertise with which you crafted and guided the discussion. It's been, as I say, a fascinating, absorbing discussion, and thanks very much to your management of that. Also, if I can thank Professor Michael Frater and Professor Tom Frame, as well as all the staff here at UNSW for your efforts in making this evening such a great success, and also for the partnership between the National Archives of Australia and the university, such a success as well. And this event tonight is indeed an ornament on that successful undertaking. So you are to be congratulated. We're a very civilised crowd here in Canberra. I'm also pleased everyone kept their shoes on tonight, Mr. Howard, so I think that's something to be thankful for. So I thank all of you for doing that, especially you with the strong arms up in the back row there. That was very good. So look, thank you all again this evening, and please join me once again in thanking the Honourable John Howard.